Section 19 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Leo the Great, Part 1. A.D. 390 to 461. Foundation of the Papacy. With the great man who forms the subject of this lecture are identified those principles which lay at the foundation of the Roman Catholic power for 1500 years. I do not say that he is the founder of the Roman Catholic Church, for that is another question. Roman Catholicism, as a polity or government or institution, is one thing, and Roman Catholicism as a religion is quite another, although they have often been confounded. As a government or polity it is peculiar, the result of the experience of ages, adapted to society and nations in a certain state of progress or development, with evils and corruptions, of course, like all other human institutions. As a religion, although it superadded many dogmas and rites which the Protestants do not accept, and for which they can see no divine authority, like auricular confession, the deification of the Virgin, indulgences for sin, and the infallibility of the Pope, still it has at the same time defended the cardinal principles of Christian faith and morality, such as the personality and sovereignty of God, the divinity of Christ, salvation in consequence of his sufferings and death, immortality, the final judgment, the necessity of a holy life, temperance, humility, patience, and the virtues which were taught upon the Mount and enforced by the original disciples and apostles whose writings are accepted as inspired. In treating so important a subject as that represented by Leo the Great, we must bear in mind these distinctions. While Leo is conceded to have been a devout Christian and a noble defender of the faith as we receive it, one of the lights of the early Christian Church, numbered even among the fathers of the Church with Augustine and Chrysostom, his special claim to greatness is that to him we trace some of the first great developments of the Roman Catholic power as an institution. More than any other one man, he laid the foundation stone of that edifice which alike sheltered and imprisoned the European nations for more than 1,000 years. He was not a great theologian like Augustine, or a preacher like Chrysostom, but he was a great bishop like Ambrose, even far greater, inasmuch as he was the organizer of new forces in the administration of his important diocese. In fact, he was a great statesman, as the more able of the popes always aspired to be. He was the associate and equal of princes. It was the sublime effort of Leo to make the Church the guardian of spiritual principles, and to give it a theocratic character and aim, which links his name with the mightiest moral movements of the world, and when I speak of the Church, I mean the Church of Rome, as presided over by men who claimed to be the successors of Saint Peter, to whom they assert Christ has given the supreme control over all other churches as his vicars on the earth. It was the great object of Leo to substantiate this claim and root it in the minds of the newly converted barbarians, and then institute laws and measures which should make his authority and that of his successors paramount in all spiritual matters, thus centering in his see the general oversight of the Christian Church in all the countries of Europe. It was a theocratic aspiration, one of the grandest that ever entered into the mind of a man of genius, yet, as Protestants now look at it, a usurpation, the beginning of a vast system of spiritual tyranny in order to control the minds and consciences of men. It took several centuries to develop this system, after Leo was dead. With him it was not a vulgar greed of power, but an inspiration of genius, a grand idea to make the Church which he controlled a benign and potent influence on society, and to prevent civilization from being utterly crushed out by the victorious Goths and Vandals. It is the success of this idea which stamps the Church as the great leading power of medieval ages, a power alike majestic and venerable, benignant yet despotic, humble yet arrogant and usurping. But before I can present this subtle contradiction, in all its mighty consequences both for good and evil, I must allude to the Roman See and the condition of society when Leo began his memorable pontificate as the precursor of the Gregories and the Clements of later times. Like all great powers, it was very gradually developed. It was as long in reaching its culminating greatness as that temporal empire which controlled the ancient world. Pagan Rome extended her sway by generals and armies; mediaeval Rome by her prelates and her principles. However the humble origin of the Church of Rome, in the early part of the 5th century, it was doubtless the greatest see, or seat of episcopal power, in Christendom. The Bishop of Rome had the largest number of dependent bishops, and was the first of clerical dignitaries. As early as A.D. 250, 60 years before Constantine's conversion and during the times of persecution, such a man as Cyprian, metropolitan bishop of Carthage, yielded to him the precedence, and possibly the presidency, because his see was the world's metropolis. And when the seat of empire was removed to the banks of the Bosporus, the power of the Roman bishop, instead of being diminished, was rather increased, since he was more independent of the emperors than was the Bishop of Constantinople. And especially after Rome was taken by the Goths, he alone possessed the attributes of sovereignty. He had already towered as far above ordinary bishops in magnificence and prestige as Caesar had above Fabricius. It was the great name of Rome, after all, which was the mysterious talisman that elevated the Bishop of Rome above other metropolitans. Who can estimate the moral power of that glorious name which had awed the world for 1,000 years? Even to barbarians that proud capital was sacred. The whole world believed her to be eternal; she alone had the prestige of universal dominion. The queen of cities might be desolated like Babylon or Tyre, but her influence was indestructible. In her very ruins she was majestic. Her laws, her literature, and her language still were the pride of nations. They revered her as the mother of civilization, clung to the remembrance of her glories, and refused to let her die. She was to the barbarians what Athens had been to the Romans, what modern Paris is to the world of fashion, what London ever will be to the people of America and Australia, the center of a proud civilization. So the bishops of such a city were great in spite of themselves, no matter whether they were remarkable as individuals or not. They were the occupants of a great office, and while their city ruled the world, it was not necessary for them to put forth any new claims to dignity or power. No person and no city disputed their preeminence. They lived in a marble palace; they were clothed in purple and fine linen; they were surrounded by sycophants; nobles and generals waited in their antechambers; they were the companions of princes; they controlled enormous revenues; they were the successors of the high pontiffs of imperial domination. Yet for 300 years few of them were eminent. It is not the order of Providence that great posts, to which men are elected by inferiors, should be filled with great men. Such are always feared, and have numerous enemies who defeat their elevation. Moreover, it is only in crises of eminent danger that signal abilities are demanded. Men are preferred for exalted stations who will do no harm, who have talent rather than genius; men who have business capacities, who have industry and modesty and agreeable manners, who, if noted for anything, are noted for their character. Hence we do not read of more than 2 or 3 bishops, for 300 years, who stood out preeminently among their contemporaries. And these were inferior to Origen, who was a teacher in a theological school, and to Jerome, who was a monk in an obscure village. Even Augustine, to whose authority in theology the Catholic Church still professes to bow down, as the schools of the Middle Ages did to Aristotle, was the bishop of an unimportant see in northern Africa. Only Clement in the 1st century and Innocent in the 4th loomed up above their contemporaries. As for the rest, great as was their dignity as bishops, it is absurd to attribute to them schemes for enthralling the world. No such plans arose in the bosom of any of them. Even Leo I merely prepared the way for universal domination; he had no such deep laid schemes as Gregory VII. Or Boniface VIII. The primacy of the Bishop of Rome was all that was conceded by other bishops for 400 years, and this on the ground of the grandeur of his capital. Even this was disputed by the Bishop of Constantinople, and continued to be until that capital was taken by the Turks. But with the waning power, glory, and wealth of Rome, decimated, pillaged, trodden under foot by Goths and Vandals, rebuked by Providence, deserted by emperors, abandoned to decay and ruin, some expedient or new claim to precedency was demanded to prevent the Roman bishops from sinking into mediocrity. It was at this crisis that the pontificate of Leo began, in the year 440. It was a gloomy period, not only for Rome, but for civilization. The queen of cities had been repeatedly sacked, and her treasures destroyed or removed to distant cities. Her proud citizens had been sold as slaves. Her noble matrons had been violated. Her grand palaces had been leveled with the ground. Her august senators were fugitives and exiles. All kinds of calamities overspread the earth and decimated the race, war, pestilence, and famine. Men in despair hid themselves in caves and monasteries. Literature and art were crushed. No great works of genius appeared. The paralysis of despair deadened all the energies of civilized man. Even armies lost their vigor, and citizens refused to enlist. The old mechanism of the Caesars, which had kept the Empire together for 300 years after all vitality had fled, was worn out. The general demoralization had led to a general destruction. Vice was succeeded by universal violence, and that by universal ruin. Old laws and restraints were no longer of any account. A civilization based on material forces and pagan arts had proven a failure. The whole world appeared to be on the eve of dissolution. To the thoughtful men of the age everything seemed to be involved in one terrific mess of desolation and horror. Even Jerome, says a great historian, heaped together the awful passages of the Old Testament on the capture of Jerusalem and other Eastern cities, and the noble lines of Virgil on the sack of Troy are but feeble descriptions of the night which covered the Western Empire. Now Leo was the man for such a crisis, and seems to have been raised up to devise some new principle of conservation around which the stricken world might rally. He stood equally alone and superior, says Milman, in the Christian world. All that survived of Rome, of her unbounded ambition, of her inflexible will, and of her belief in her title to universal dominion, seemed concentrated in him alone. Leo was born in the latter part of the fourth century at Rome, of noble parents, and was intensely Roman in all his aspirations. He early gave indications of future greatness, and was consecrated to a service in which only talent was appreciated. When he was nothing but an acolyte, whose duty it was to light the lamps and attend on the bishop, he was sent to Africa, and honored with the confidence of the great Bishop of Hippo. And he was only deacon when he was sent by the Emperor Valentinian III. To heal the division between Aetius and Albinus, rival generals whose dissensions compromised the safety of the empire. He was absent on important missions when the death of Sixtus, A.D. 440, left the papacy without a head. On Leo were all eyes now fixed, and he was immediately summoned by the clergy and the people of Rome, in whom the right of election was vested, to take possession of the vacant throne. He did not affect unworthiness like Gregory in later years, but accepted at once the immense responsibility. I need not enumerate his measures and acts. Like all great and patriotic statesmen, he selected the wisest and ablest men he could find as subordinates, and condescended himself to those details which he inexorably extracted from others. He even mounted the neglected pulpit of his metropolitan church to preach to the people, like Chrysostom and Gregory Nazianzen at Constantinople. His sermons are not models of eloquence or style, but are practical, powerful, earnest, and orthodox. Athanasius himself was not more evangelical, or Ambrose more impressive. He was the especial foe of all the heresies which characterized the age. He did battle with all who attempted to subvert the Nicene Creed. Those whom he especially rebuked were the Manicheans, men who made the greatest pretension to intellectual culture and advanced knowledge, and yet whose lives were disgraced not merely by the most offensive intellectual pride, but the most disgraceful vices; men who confounded all the principles of moral obligation, and who polluted even the atmosphere of Rome by downright pagan licentiousness. He had no patience with these false philosophers, and he had no mercy. He even complained of them to the emperor, as Calvin did of Servetus to the civil authorities of Geneva, which I grant was not to his credit; and the result was that these dissolute and pretentious heretics were expelled from the army and from all places of trust and emolument. Many people in our enlightened times would denounce this treatment as illiberal and persecuting, and justly. But consider his age and circumstances. What was Leo to do as the guardian of the faith in those dreadful times? Was he to suffer those who poisoned all the sources of renovation which then remained to go unrebuked and unpunished? He may have said in his defence, "Shall I, the bishop of this diocese, the appointed guardian of faith and morals in a period of alarming degeneracy, shall I, armed with the sword of St. Peter, stop to draw the line between injuries inflicted by the tongue and injuries inflicted by the hand? Shall we defend our persons, our property, and our lives, and take no notice of those who impiously and deliberately would destroy our souls by their envenomed blasphemies? Shall we allow the wells of water which spring up to everlasting life to be poisoned by the impious atheists and scoffers who in every age set themselves up against Christ and his kingdom, and are only allowed by God Almighty to live, as the wild beasts of the deserts, or scorpions and serpents, are allowed to live? Let them live, but let us defend ourselves against their teeth and fangs. Are the overseers of God's people, in a world of shame, to be mere philosophical Gallios, indifferent to our higher interests? Is it a Christian duty to permit an avalanche of evils to overwhelm the Church on the plea of toleration? Shall we suffer when we have the power to prevent it, a pandemonium of scoffers and infidels and sentimental casuists to run riot in the city which is entrusted to us to guard? Not thus will we be disloyal to our trusts. Men have souls to save, and we will come to the rescue with any weapons we can lay our hands upon. The Church is the only hope of the world, not merely in our unsettled times, but for all ages. And hence I, as the guardian of those spiritual principles which lie at the root of all healthy progress in civilization, and all religious life, will not tamely and ignobly see those principles subverted by dangerous and infidel speculations, even if they are attractive to cultivated but irreligious classes. Such may have been the arguments, it is not unreasonable to suppose, which influenced the great Leo in his undoubted persecutions. Persecutions, we should remember, which were then endorsed by the Catholic Church. They would be condemned in our times by all enlightened men, but they were the only remedy known in that age against dangerous opinions. So Leo put down the Manicheans and preserved the unity of the faith, which was of immeasurable importance in the sea of anarchies which at that time was submerging all the traditions of the past. Leo also distinguished himself by writing a treatise on the Incarnation, said to be the ablest which has come down to us from the primitive Church. He was one of those men who believed in theology as a series of divine declarations, to be cordially received whether they are fully grasped by the intellect or not. These declarations pertain to most momentous interests, and hence transcend in dignity any question which mere philosophy ever attempted to grasp, or physical science ever brought forward. In spite of the sneers of the infidels, or the attacks of savans, or the temporary triumph of false opinions, let us remember they have endured during the mighty conflicts of the last 1800 years, and will endure through all the conflicts of ages, the might, the majesty, and the glory of the kingdom of Christ. Whoever thus conserves truths so important is a great benefactor, whether neglected or derided, whether despised or persecuted. In addition to the labors of Leo to preserve the integrity of the received faith among the semi barbaric Western nations, his efforts were equally great to heal the disorders of the Church. He reformed ecclesiastical discipline in Africa, rent by Arian factions and Donatist schismatics. He curtailed the abuses of metropolitan tyranny in Gaul. He sent his legates to preside over the councils of Ephesus and Chalcedon. He sat in judgment between Vienna and Arles. He fought for the independence of the Church against emperors and barbaric chieftains. He encouraged literature and missions and schools and the spread of the Bible. He was the paragon of a bishop, a man of transcendent dignity of character, as well as a father of the Church universal, of whom all Christendom should be proud. Among Leo's memorable acts as one of the great lights of his age was the part he was called upon to perform as a powerful intercessor with the barbaric kings. When Attila with his swarm of Mongol conquerors appeared in Italy, the "scourge of God," as he was called, the instrument of Providence in punishing the degenerate rulers and people of the falling empire, Leo was sent by the affrighted emperor to the barbarians' camp to make what terms he could. The savage Hun, who feared not the armies of the emperor, stood awestruck, we are told, before the minister of God, and, swayed by his eloquence and personal dignity, consented to retire from Italy for the hand of the Princess Honoria. And when afterwards Genseric, at the head of his Vandals, became master of the capital, he was likewise influenced by the powerful intercession of the bishop, and consented to spare the lives of the Romans and preserve the public buildings and churches from conflagration. Genseric could not yield up the spoil of the fallen capital, and his soldiers transported to Carthage, the seat of the new Vandal kingdom, the riches and trophies which illustrious generals had won, yea, the treasures of 3 religions, the gods of the Capitoline Temple, the golden candlesticks which Titus brought from Jerusalem, and the sacred vessels which adorned the churches of the Christians, and which Alaric had spared. Thus far the intrepid Bishop of Rome, for he was nothing more, calls forth our sympathy and admiration for the hand he had in establishing the faith and healing the divisions of the Church, for which he earned the title of saint. He taught no errors like Origen, and pushed out no theological doctrines into a jargon of metaphysics like Athanasius. He was more practical than Jerome, and more moderate than Augustine. But he instituted a claim, from motives of policy, which subsequently ripened into an irresistible government, on which the papal structure as an institution or polity rests. He did not put forth this claim, however, until the old capital of the Caesars was humiliated, vanquished, and completely prostrated as a political power. When the Eternal City was taken a second time, and her riches plundered, and her proud palaces leveled with the dust; when her amphitheatre was deserted, her senatorial families were driven away as fugitives and sold as slaves, and her glory was departed, nothing left her but recollections and broken columns and ruined temples and weeping matrons, ashes, groans, and lamentations, miseries and most bitter sorrows, then did her great bishop, intrepid amid general despair, lay the foundation of a new empire, vaster in its influence, if not in its power, than that which raised itself up among the nations in the proudest days of Vespasian and the Antonines. Leo, from one of the devastated hills of Rome, once crowned with palaces, temples, and monuments, looked out upon the Christian world and saw the desolation spoken of by Jeremy the prophet, as well as by the Cumaean Sibyl, all central power hopelessly prostrated, law and justice bywords, provinces wasted, decimated, and anarchical, literature and art crushed, vice, in all its hateful deformity, rampant and multiplying itself, false opinions gaining ground, Christians adopting the errors of paganism, soldiers turned into banditti, the contemplative hiding themselves in caves and deserts, the rich made slaves, barbarians everywhere triumphant, women shrieking in terror, bishops praying in despair, a world disordered, a pandemonium of devils let loose, one terrific and howling mass of moral and physical desolation, such as had never been seen since Noah entered into the ark. Amid this dreary wreck of the old civilization, which had been supposed to be eternal, what were Leo's designs and thoughts? In this mournful crisis, what did he dream of in his sad and afflicted soul? To flee into a monastery, as good men in general despair and wretchedness did, and patiently wait for the coming of his Lord and for the new dispensation? Not at all. He contemplated the foundation of a new power which should restore law, preserve literature, subdue the barbarians, introduce a still higher civilization than that which had perished, not by bringing back the Caesars, but by making himself Caesar, a revived central power which the nations should respect and obey. That which the world needed was this new central power, to settle difficulties, depose tyrants, establish a common standard of faith and worship, encourage struggling genius, and conserve peace. Who but the Church could do this? The Church was the last hope of the fallen empire. The Church should put forth her theocratic aspirations. The keys of St. Peter should be more potent than the scepters of kings. The Church should not be crushed in the general desolation. She was still the mighty power of the world. Christianity had taken hold of the hearts and minds of men, and raised its voice to console and encourage amid universal despair. Men's thoughts were turned to God and to his vicegerents. He was mighty to save. His promises were a glorious consolation. The Church should arise, put on her beautiful garments, and go on from conquering to conquer. A theocracy should restore civilization. The world wanted a new Christian sovereign, reigning by divine right, not by armies, not by force, by an appeal to the future fears and hopes of men. Force had failed; it was divided against itself. Barbaric chieftains defied the emperors and all temporal powers. Rival generals desolated provinces. The world was plunging into barbarism. The imperial sceptre was broken. Not a diadem, but a tiara must be the emblem of universal sovereignty. Not imperial decrees, but papal bulls must now rule the world. Who but the Bishop of Rome could wear this tiara? Who but he could be the representative of the new theocracy? He was the bishop of the metropolis whose empire could never pass away. But his city was in ruins. If his claim to precedency rested on the grandeur of his capital, he must yield to the Bishop of Constantinople. He must found a new claim, not on the greatness and antiquity of his capital, but on the superstitious veneration of the Christian world, a claim which would be accepted. Now it happened that one of Leo's predecessors had instituted such a claim, which he would revive and enforce with new energy. Innocent had maintained, 40 years before Leo, that the primacy of the Roman See was derived from St. Peter, that Christ had delegated to Peter supreme power as chief of the apostles, and that he, as the successor of St. Peter, was entitled to his jurisdiction and privileges. This is the famous jus divinum principle, which constitutes the cornerstone of the papal fabric. On this claim was based the subsequent encroachments of the Pope. Leo saw the force of this claim and adopted it and entrenched himself behind it, and became forthwith more formidable than any of his predecessors or any living bishop, and he was sure that so long as the claim was allowed, no matter whether his city was great or small, his successors would become the spiritual dictators of Christendom. The dignity and power of the Roman bishop were now based on a new foundation. He was still venerable from the souvenirs of the Empire, but more potent as the successor of the chief of the apostles. Ambrose had successfully asserted the independent spiritual power of the bishops. Leo seized that sceptre and claimed it for the Bishop of Rome. Section 20.